Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to look at the rise of heavy industry. Gee, what fun. But it's important. Keep in mind, prior to the era we were studying, beginning in about 1870s, 1876, America was largely rural. The average American had grown up in a small town or on a farm. That's beginning to change in the 1870s. We're beginning to become far more of an urban nation and a nation driven far more by technology, as we pointed out. This is when we become the greatest industrial nation on earth. We surpass the other two great nations, Britain and Germany. It's also leading up to what becomes the so-called American century, the 20th century. As we pointed out the other day, the rise of manufacturing is going to create either tremendous wealth or tremendous poverty. And to give you an idea of the rise of wealth, in 1845, the richest man in America was John Jacob Astor. He owned dry goods stores and was involved in the fur business out west. And he died that year and left a fortune of a whopping $25 million. Which, by the way, I would take in a heartbeat. I don't care if it is a modest fortune today. But he was the richest man in America, $25 million. By 1892, there were over 4,000 millionaires in the U.S. And one of the most notorious, Jay Gould, he died that year and left a fortune of $100 million. And he wasn't even the wealthiest at that point. By 1900, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie were all certified billionaires. If you equated Rockefeller's fortune with our money today, he'd be worth $386 billion. Worth more than some countries. And here is the ruthless but brilliant J.D. Rockefeller, who used dynamite to destroy his competitors and then teach Sunday school.
You said he was richer than some countries today, but was he richer than some countries back then? With the fortune he did have?
I really don't have that information, to be honest with you, but at $300 billion back then, he probably was. That's just a guess. It'd be fun to find out, wouldn't it? And as we pointed out, there are several reasons for the rapid growth of industry worldwide, but in particular in the United States. And one is the rise of new technologies. Between 1790 and 1860, the U.S. Patent Office was established in 1790. In that 70-year period, they issued a total of 36,000 patents. Between 1860 and 1890, a 30-year period, they issued 440,000 new patents. That gives you some idea of all the new inventions that are coming on the market. And by the way, a lot of these were failures and were never made, but still the sheer numbers should tell you something. A lot of them had to do with manufacturing or business. The Bessemer process for manufacturing steel, for example. And we didn't invent that, the British did. But we invented a lot of notable things, especially business inventions. The typewriter in 1868 the telephone by 1876, and by the 1890s, there was a whopping 500,000 phones in service. 1879, the cash register. 1891, the adding machine. All of these things relatively obsolete today, but transformed their world back then. Another advantage we had when it came to industrialization was natural resources. One of the things this country has been blessed with, far more than most other nations, quite frankly, is natural resources. We have tremendous reserves of iron, copper, zinc, tin, oil, coal, everything you needed for an industrial revolution. There were few things that we had to import. You look at almost any of the other industrial nations, they may have a lot of one or two of these things, but most of them lacked certain key minerals or sources of fuel. Japan, for example, when they industrialized, Japan doesn't have any oil. They have to import all of their oil, for example. So the United States had everything we needed for an industrial revolution, and far more of it than most other countries. We had cheap transportation, the railroads and the steamships. And we had new sources of power. The original Industrial Revolution was powered by steam. The second Industrial Revolution is going to be powered more by electricity. Yep, one of them newfangled inventions back then. Oh, speaking of newfangled inventions, here is the great-great-grandfather of your cell phone. This is an ad from 1886 for a reliable acoustic telephone. And by the way, the phone costs $10 each, which would be about the equivalent of a new cell phone today, about $1,500. So they're relatively expensive. You ever hear of a party line?
That phone didn't work, did it?
Huh?
That didn't work, did it?
No, but they had them for decades.
It worked.
Yeah, they worked, but they were a pain in the rear. It was a lot cheaper way to get phone service. You shared a telephone number with 2 or 3 other families. So you could pick up the phone to use it, and there'd already be somebody talking on it. And you'd kind of have to wait till they were done or ask them to hang up or whatever before you could use your own phone. It also led to a whole lot of eavesdropping, by the way. That was the biggest problem. Some people entertained themselves by picking up the phone and listening in on other people's calls. That'd probably be on reality television today. Another reason American industry excels was highly efficient organization. There are 2 ways, basically, American industry organized. Vertical integration, control of an industry from the bottom to the top. Otherwise, you mine the raw material, you refine the raw material, and then you sell the refined product, and then you sell it. So you control the process from the beginning to the end. That's the model J.D. Rockefeller will use to make Standard Oil the biggest oil company in the world. Rockefeller controlled everything. He controlled the oil fields, he controlled the refineries, he controlled the distribution networks. The other way was horizontal, basically controlling several companies in the same industry. basically a monopoly, or close to it. That's how the railroads operated back then. It was very common for railroad magnates to try and buy up all of the competing lines. So they didn't control the manufacturer of locomotives or anything, but they controlled all the railroads. Another change, business began using professional managers. Something that makes common sense today, but not back then. Before that, you might have your idiot brother-in-law running the business for you. You may not be particularly good at it. How do you fire your brother-in-law, right? And keep peace in the family. Businesses started hiring professional managers, people trained in how to run a business. And they had the added advantage, if they don't work out, you can fire them and keep peace in the family, right? So professionalization starts coming in. You see the first professional business schools. Harvard, in Penn, University of Penn, places like that. By the way, these are the two comparisons of the business models used here. This one with the meat packing. You go from cow to hamburger. Yeah, it's getting close to lunch. And last but not least, American business benefited greatly from help from the U.S. government and protection from the U.S. government. The idea of laissez-faire economics, what is laissez-faire, by the way? All you budding business majors out there. Haven't got to that yet. Anybody know what laissez-faire economics means? Yes, sir.
Isn't it where the government stays out of, like, businesses and stuff, the economy?
Yeah, thank you. Very good. It's French for let alone. Government keeps its hand off of business. And you still hear that today, but the reality is American business would not be what it is today without government help and interference. It's that simple. They didn't do it on their own. They benefited heavily from U.S. government support. To begin with, the railroads, so they could expand out west, were given hundreds of millions of acres of public land for free. The idea was they could sell it to finance the railroads. U.S. tariff policy protected American business. There were high import duties on most products coming into the United States, much like they're trying to impose now. For example, to make American steel competitive with British steel, American steel, quite frankly, was inferior to both British and German steel back then. What the British were pumping out at Sheffield and what the Krupp Works was producing in Germany was far superior to anything we made here. You know how we caught up with them? We stole the formulas. Same thing we accuse China of doing today, by the way. China is stealing our technology, without a doubt.
You mean World War II, when we took all the German technology?
No, I'm saying,
Earlier?
yeah, back in the 1860s and 1870s,
We did.
to get a jump on the competitors, we stole technology from the British and Germans. Yeah, flat out. Put it to good use, but we still stole it. But anyway, to make American steel competitive, in 1881, U.S. government slapped a $28 a ton import duty on British steel. By the way, who ultimately pays the price for these protective tariffs? You guys. It means things are going to cost more for the consumer. So you pay a price to protect huge American corporations when there are high tariff duties. Just wait, if this tariff war goes on much longer, wait till you see the sticker price on a new car. Price of steel is going to go through the ceiling.
Well, you were saying back then, the tariffs, they were for more quality goods, so we would pay more for cheaper stuff.
Yeah, we would have to pay more for something to protect American industry.
But it was crap.
In many cases it was, yeah. When it came to steel, not everything, but when it came to something like steel, yeah. And it wasn't necessarily crap, but it wasn't as good as what our competitors were putting out. And like I said, we stole the formulas and eventually produced steel just as good, but I'll give you another example. U.S. government in 1890 slapped a 40-cent a gallon import duty on kerosene. Now, it may not seem like a big deal to you, but kerosene was much more widely used back then. Most people didn't have electricity. They needed kerosene for heating lamps, lighting, and cooking. In fact, that's where Rockefeller originally made his fortune, not in gasoline. Before the rise of the automobile, that was a waste product. A lot of the refineries just burned it off. Could you imagine that today? Kerosene was where they made their money. To protect Rockefeller, U.S. government slapped a 40-cent a gallon import duty on it. Rockefeller could manufacture it and sell it for a profit for as little as 10 cents a gallon. Yet they still put a huge import duty on it. So it allowed American business to compete, but ultimately cost the consumer a lot more. Another way the government helped the business was the 14th Amendment. When the 14th Amendment was originally passed, its framers didn't have American business in mind. What was the 14th Amendment designed to protect?
The slaves that were just freed.
Thank you, very good. Yes, the newly emancipated African Americans. To make sure that their rights weren't being violated. The Due Process Clause. Well, conservative courts applied that to American business, giving them huge protection from lawsuits, unionization, and other things. Under U.S. law, folks, a corporation is a human being, a person. I never thought of Procter & Gamble as a person. And new incorporation laws. In 1889, New Jersey passed a new law allowing corporations incorporated in New Jersey to buy or own parts of other corporations outside the state. It's the origins of the modern holding company. Basically allowed one company to own several companies. And the other advantage is you didn't have to incorporate in every state you did business in. And eventually every other state will adopt this. You've heard of Berkshire Hathaway, haven't you? Yeah. That's one of the largest holding companies. Look at a list sometimes of all the companies they own. It's amazing, isn't it? They're a holding company. They basically make their money by owning other companies. And there's new marketing and advertising. If you can mass produce products, you got to find a way to advertise them and sell them, right? Before this era, if you went into the local dry goods store and you needed soap, what did you ask for? soap. And you got this generic bar, like in a brown paper wrapper. That begins to change in this era. You begin to get brand names and you begin to get advertising. In 1879, a large, what is now a huge Cincinnati corporation, back then it was a small group of candle makers, Procter & Gamble began to market what they called Ivory soap. That was one of the first brand names in history. Now you could actually walk into a store and ask for a specific type. Some of the earlier brand names, Quaker Oats, Campbell Soup, Bull Durham Tobacco, all of them are still with us, right? You know the Campbell Soup can? It hasn't changed much since 1900. The design of the can, I don't know about the soup inside. But they've had pretty much the same label for close to 120 years now. Aunt Jemima has been around almost as long. She's undergone a lot of changes to make her less racist, but as a corporate symbol, that's been around for over 100 years. Now, if you have brand names, you need marketing slogans. Anybody remember Ivory's? It was the soap that floats. And by the way, that had been a manufacturing disaster originally. You know why the soap floats? They taught it to swim, not to. It's got more air in it than normal soap. During the manufacturing process, some of their technicians screwed up, and they thought they had ruined the batch because the darn stuff floated. Then somebody said, maybe we can turn this to our advantage. So from an industrial accident was born a great marketing slogan. And it made Procter & Gamble pretty much what it is today, folks. Now, if that soap would have sank, we probably never heard of it. And here's some original Ivory soap, Procter & Gamble. And one of their early ads, 1898. It floats. Even if you're washing out in the street, eh?
It is.
Yeah. Now, one of the problems with American industry, all this rapid growth, it also brought cutthroat competition, instability, and no government regulation. Which, by the way, meant you had no idea what went into the new processed foods you were going to eat. A lot of the new loaves of bread you could buy in the market were full of sawdust as filler. The next time people tell you about useless government regulations, ask them how much cellulose they want in their bread. But overproduction is a key problem in many industries. Oil refinery. Only about 75% of the nation's refining capacity was in operation at any one time. There was a glut of refiners. Industrialists tried to bring some stability and more profit by creating monopolies, or as they called them back then, pooling the market, pooling agreements. Otherwise, all the railroads would get together and set the price for a railroad ticket, or how much it cost you to haul a ton of goods on the railroad. or how much it costs you for a gallon of kerosene, or a pound of flour. Why do these pools, these agreements that are now illegal, by the way, why do they fall apart? Get a little hint. The same reason every time OPEC sets production quotas, they fall apart and fail, as their most recent attempt is bound to do in this little fun circle. Greed. You can't count on everybody keeping their word. Sooner or later, somebody breaks the pool or the agreement, wants to undercut the opposition, and the whole thing falls apart, and you have instability and chaos again. So greed and ruthless competition undercuts all of this. And on top of that, monopolies and pools were considered bad, which they are by the government and the public, because they can rig the prices for things. If you have competition, somebody's going to lower their prices to attract new customers. When you eliminate competition, then they can charge whatever they want. The public had a justifiable fear of these growing monopolies. And here's a cartoon illustrating the public fear and influence, in this case of Standard Oil. They're often portrayed as octopi like that, octopuses. And notice the Capitol, the State House, White House. The wealth of corporate America and their desire to make more profits helped fuel the corruption in government in this era. The legislature in Pennsylvania was so corrupt and so influenced by the oil industry, the standard joke was that Rockefeller had done everything with it but refine it. Pun on the oil industry if you don't get it. His bagman would literally walk into the legislature and dole out the money. How's that for, government action? Tremendous corruption back then. So the question became, are these men of industry, quote, captains of industry, or robber barons? Congress is beginning to become alarmed about the unfair business and labor practices, and make the first feeble attempts to rein in American industry and bring some order out of chaos. In 1887, Congress moved to regulate what was at that time the largest single industry in America. Anybody know what it was? This was the most dominant industry in America back then.
Did you say steel already? Did you say steel yesterday?
That's a product, but this is,
An industry?
yeah, business. And it makes sense if you think about it.
Car?
Close. Who said that? Way to get, you're 2 for 2.
What was it?
Railroads. Yeah, you're right with the transportation, but the railroads were the single biggest industry. After 1900, it will be the steel industry. And today, I really don't know what it would be. I guess it might even be the software industry. I really don't know. But in 1887, Congress passes the Interstate Commerce Act, designed to regulate railroad companies. How much they could charge for transportation, for tickets. It regulated the competition between the railroads, the routes they could use. It also created the Interstate Commerce Commission. Really one of the first government bodies to regulate an industry. And in 1890, they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was the first federal law aimed at limiting abuses by large corporations. It outlawed monopolies, pools, got to use the exact term, quote, restraint of trade by pull, contract, or monopoly, end quote. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a major step forward, but it had serious flaws, at least in the beginning. To begin with, how many of you folks in here can define the term restraint of trade?
Let's see, have restraint on your trade, so don't trade, so, and carry. I don't know.
Yeah, actually,
Don't trade, so uncarry.
the courts couldn't decide either, is my point. If any of you folks would have come up with a definitive answer, you need to be on the Supreme Court. Because that courts couldn't figure it out. It's a vague term. There's a lot of terms that sound specific, but are rather vague when you actually dig into them, right? And that's one of them. Secondly, the courts back then were notoriously conservative. They were far more interested in protecting business rights than human rights. And the courts will interpret the Sherman Antitrust Act as narrowly as possible. In 1895, in the United States versus E.C. Knight Company, Knight is in shining armor type, E.C. Knight Company was a sugar conglomerate, and they were being sued as a monopoly. And the courts, in their wisdom, said that E.C. Knight and Company was not a monopoly, even though they controlled 98% of the sugar refining capacity in this country. 98%. That doesn't make them a monopoly. Yeah, that other 2% has a real good chance of knocking them off, doesn't it? Get my point about the conservative courts and how they interpret the law? The Sherman Antitrust Act is relatively useless at first. Later, and I'll talk about this later when we get to the reform movements, the populists, and in particular the progressives, and in particular Teddy Roosevelt, they used the Sherman Antitrust Act rather efficiently to bring down illegal monopolies. But when it's first passed, it has its limits, folks. It is a step in the right direction, though. And by the way, here, you want to talk about the robber barons? Here's probably one of the scariest of them all. The financier, John Pierpont J.P. Morgan. Just look at the look on his face. Enough to scare little children. Now, stability was achieved in some industries through consolidation, where one major business owner either bought up or ran out his competition. And Rockefeller, J.D. Rockefeller, is probably the best example of that. He establishes Standard Oil and eventually controls 84% of the oil industry. He did it in many ways. He'd buy you out. You had a refinery or an oil field, he'll make you a partner. He'll give you stock in Standard Oil in return for your refinery or whatever. And by the way, the business owners that took him up on these deals died rich because they grew along with Standard Oil. But a lot of people wanted to remain independent. They have that right. If you didn't sell out to Rockefeller, he would undercut you. He'd sell his products, his oil, his gas, his kerosene at such a low price, you'd go bankrupt. He could afford to do that. He could afford to take a loss short term. You couldn't. That doesn't work. He was known to use sabotage. Blow up other people's refineries. Use dynamite, actually. Worked pretty well. So one way or the other, he was going to dominate. In 1901, our scary guy up here, J.P. Morgan, creates U.S. Steel. It's America's first billion-dollar corporation. And in its first year, it produces 67% of all the steel produced in this country. By 1901, 1% of American corporations control more than 33% of the nation's manufacturing capability. So you've got concentration in the hands of a few magnates in certain industries. And you see the same thing in the railroad industry and others. Now, what's it like to work for these corporate barons? Work in a factory or a sweatshop in this era means long hours, low pay, and often unsafe conditions. What do you think the average work week was in 1897? Take a guess.
14-hour days.
In some industries. How many hours do you work a week? On average. 60. That's the average work week for the average laborer back then. Average of 10-hour days, 6 days a week. And by the way, some industries do run 14-hour shifts. The railroad industry. How many of you folks want to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week? Now, wages do go up. Between 1860 and 1890, wages rose 50% in that era. Between 1890 and 1914, they rise another 37%. And despite the high tariffs, I want to point out, with mass manufacturing, and especially with the commercialization of the agriculture industry, the growth of mega corporate farms, consumer prices actually drop, especially for food. It becomes cheaper to feed your family in this era than it had been earlier. Now, having said that, most workers are still grossly underpaid. The average factory worker in 1900 made a whopping 21.6 cents an hour. How many of you folks want to work for 22 cents an hour, basically? And if you want to do the math, that works out to a whopping $490 a year. Rockefeller's worth $1 billion, you're worth $490 a year. Women and children often work 12 hours a day in cotton mills, factories, and sweatshops for as little as 50 cents a day. And in a lot of the textile mills, the women were locked in so they couldn't take breaks. Down the road, we'll talk about it, but There's a major fire in a sweatshop in New York, the Triangle Waste Shirt Factory. And a couple hundred of the workers were killed because their employers had them locked in. So needless to say, as the disparity of wealth grew and American industry grew, there's going to be friction between the factory owners and the workers. The workers begin to band together for job security and other reasons and try and form unions, something European workers were doing at the time. The key issues, and they haven't changed much, quite frankly, over the years: wages, working hours, job safety, and job security. But in this era, neither the workers nor unions had any legal federal protection. The government was pro-business and hostile to unions. And industry used propaganda to discredit labor unions. They were all full of socialists and anarchists. They want to take over the means of production. They want to own the factories and all that. There were some radical European labor movements that advocated that, worker control of the factories and things like that, but you don't see that here in America. When you see the formation of the American Federation of Labor, or later the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is now the AFL-CIO, for example, they don't want to own the means of production. They just want a decent wage. They just want decent, safe working hours. And they want a safe working environment. Any of you folks ever been in a steel mill? They're relatively safe today. They're still dangerous compared to back then. Huge cauldrons. Let's see if I can find one real quick here. Here it is. Here's a steel cauldron pouring a 90-ton ignited steel. You better know what you're doing. And by the way, if you get any of that splashed on you, it'll kill you. Burn you alive. Those are the things the unions are fighting for back then. They had a few successes. In 1883, the Knights of Labor led a successful strike against Western Union. They got a pay raise, an 8-hour workday, and my God, 1 day off a week. How's that for luxury? Most strikes, however, were unsuccessful. And the business owners either brought in Pinkertons, basically armed mercenaries, or had government collusion and call in the National Guard to break the strikes. Good example of that is the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886 against the McCormick Reaper Company. It's one of the more infamous in American history, actually. I had it here somewhere. What did I do with McCormick? And by the way, notice what languages it's in? Yeah, it's in English and German. The labor movement back then, many of the leaders happened to be German or of German ancestry. So it was very common to see labor advertisements, things like this, printed in both English and German. During a demonstration at the Haymarket in downtown Chicago on 3rd of May, 1886, police shoot into the crowd and kill several strikers. The next day at a rally at the Haymarket, and by the way, the protesters have been relatively peaceful. They hadn't provoked police, and they were peaceful again on the 4th. It was a cold, drizzly day, and the mayor who had been there, gave one of the speeches, decided, nothing's going to happen today, everybody's peaceful, and told the police to go home. Shortly after he did that, a bomb exploded, killed 7 police, and injured hundreds of people. And then the police panicked and fired into the crowd and shot 4 innocent people. This is what's known as the Haymarket Riot. They never do find the actual culprit. Whoever made the bomb and put it there was never identified. Government really didn't look too hard to find the actual culprit. They used this as an excuse to crack down on the labor movement. They arrested 8 prominent labor leaders. All were immigrants, all spoke English, and all were either anarchist or socialist. Their trial attracted international attention. In fact, in Europe, they held a special day to commemorate support for them. It was on the 1st of May. That's where our term May Day comes from. And it's also, if you know anything about Europe, it's their big Labor Day. They celebrate their Labor Day on May 1st. We purposely, U.S. government, purposely moved ours to the fall to separate it from that. So an event that happens in America basically inspires the Labor Day in Europe, but we won't recognize it as such here. There is no doubt that the 8 men did not have a fair trial. The trial was rigged against them from the very beginning. All 8 are convicted, 7 received death sentences. 4 are eventually executed, and 1, Louis, commits suicide. Of the 8 involved, he was the only one that may have been guilty of anything. It's been pretty much proven since then that the other 7 were innocent of any involvement or anything like that. Louis Link, however, may have been guilty. Finally, in 1893, a more humane and pro-labor governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, pardons the remaining 3 from prison. But the Haymarket Riot is infamous. And here's a contemporary watercolor. Back then, when you don't have cell phones, you can take video or pictures quickly. But anyway, somebody did do a watercolor of it shortly thereafter. Probably a little dramatic, but now, American business owners often justified their exploitation of the workers through a philosophy called social Darwinism. And I want to point out right now that don't blame Darwin for this. This was a perversion of his theory. He had nothing whatsoever to do with the philosophy of social Darwinism. It had little, quite frankly, to do with his theory of evolution. It was developed by an English philosopher, Herbert Spencer, and it argued that human society had evolved naturally, and any interference with existing institutions would only impede progress and aid the weak. My God, we don't want to help the weak, do we? So otherwise, it's a dog-eat-dog world. Survival of the fittest. The most capable people would grow wealthy. Those that were not would wallow in poverty. So if you were a poor worker in a factory making 22 cents an hour, it was your own damn fault. The fact that you were probably born into poverty with no chance for an education or to get ahead had nothing to do with it. Or the fact that most of these robber barons had been born either into middle class or upper class families. They started out with money. One of the few exceptions, by the way, was Andrew Carnegie. Hang on, I still have a couple minutes. Carnegie actually was a poor immigrant. He was an immigrant from Scotland and did make his money through hard work, brilliance, and things like that. But he also understood what a lot of the people were going through. And where the hell did I stash Andy? He developed what he called the Gospel of Wealth, published an essay on it in the North American Review in 1889. He argued that it was the responsibility of the wealthy to give back to society. He admitted that many of them had been privileged and that they owed it to the rest of society to give a lot of that back. Look what Bill Gates has done over the years. That would be a good modern example of the gospel of wealth. Carnegie lived up to his word. He would eventually give away about $350 million of his own fortune. And what did he do with it? He built schools, hospitals, but he thought education being the key. The biggest thing he built were libraries.
Sometimes like Carnegie Hall, what is that?
Oh, that's in New York. That's an entertainment venue. Yeah, he owned that too. And the Carnegie Mellon Museum in Pittsburgh. But he would build libraries all over the world, primarily in the United States and Scotland. He eventually will build 2,509 libraries. Cincinnati has several of them. He donated $280,000 to Cincinnati new libraries. 7 of them still operate. 1 is a community center, and unfortunately 1 was torn down. But here's the Carnegie Library in Price Hill. And here's the Carnegie Library still in existence in Washington. Now, even though industry is what is dominating America and making us what we are today, remember, this is the era that we celebrate in movies and TV as the Wild West. So on Friday, bring your cowboy hats and chaps, folks. We're going out west. Okay, leave the chaps at home, all right? That'd be too weird.